Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Today is February 5th, 2020. We've been going through weeks and days of intense political activity, strategic developments, and we'll get the benefit of hearing from Helga on that today. And we'll start with the State of the Union address, which was delivered last night by President Trump. Helga, what were your impressions from hearing the president speak?
Well, I think that the State of the Union address by Trump expressed an overwhelming optimism. And, I think if you look at the action of Nancy Pelosi ripping the speech apart, I think that was more telling about the state of the Democratic Party than the speech of Trump. But I think that Trump mentioned a couple of extremely important things. The Artemis, that he wants to have the full funding of Artemis, that he wants to put a lot of emphasis on the science education. Then I thought very good was this young black student who wants to become an astronaut and not look up to the stars, but look down on the Earth from up there. So I think there were some really very strong elements in the speech. And if you look at that, together with the expected acquittal today in the Senate, it's too early to be sure, but I think one can assume it. That basically means that, Trump is really freed from all the nasty maneuvers of Russiagate, Ukrainegate, the impeachment process. And I think it's now important that the people, especially the American people, give him the support to address those things which absolutely need to be addressed now, because we still are in a strategic, very difficult moment. We still have the financial crash pending, which is expressed, among other things, by the fact that the Federal Reserve has increased the repo credit from 80 billion some times ago to 125 billion per day. And that underlines the urgency to really have a new financial architecture before it is too late. Now, I have proposed on the 3rd of January to have a summit between the presidents of the United States, Russia, and China. And I think the coronavirus crisis emphasizes also that it would be extremely necessary that also Prime Minister Modi would be part of such a summit, and that this summit then indeed addresses the global questions of the need to have a new Bretton Woods system and to have all kinds of other problems to be jointly gotten out of the way. But I think the moment is really an optimistic one, and people should just, really move forward with the LaRouche program, the 4 laws, Glass-Steagall, National Bank, New Bretton Woods, crash program for fusion and international space cooperation, and help to mobilize that the full funding for Artemis can be gotten through the Congress. And I think that is then really the basis to move the world away from a very dangerous moment and get into more safe waters. But it's not yet done. So I think it's just that the moment is ripe to really put in a new paradigm, to go back to the American system of economy, rather than being the dependency of the City of London and Wall Street. But I think it's a good moment, but momentum is extremely important to move this all forward.
You mentioned the freeing of Trump, which will likely come with the acquittal. I noticed he did mention the coming 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And this would be an ideal opportunity, wouldn't it, for him to sit down with Putin as part of your proposal for the 3-party summit, given that the whole attack on him was initially started around Russia. This does give him that opening, doesn't it?
Well, that's a very good moment, even so, this is end of April. Well, that makes it still 2 months, and in these 2 months can happen a lot. But I think, if that is seriously put on the agenda for the meeting at the Elbe on the 26th of April, or the latest, the 9th of May in Moscow, the end of the Second World War celebration, I think this would be indeed something, everybody in the United States and internationally should support, because we need to get out of this geopolitical confrontation. We need to stop to make Russia and China the enemy, because it should be clear that all the major problems of this world can only be worked on and solved if the major powers are working together. So indeed, I would call on people to absolutely have this idea in mind and support the idea that President Trump accepts the offer of Putin to go to these two meetings.
Now, with the vote today, you have people like Adam Schiff and others who are still insisting that they're going to continue investigations, maybe even bring up new articles of impeachment. But on the other side, it does open the door for Senate investigations into where this whole operation came from, who's behind it. Are you expecting that this will be followed up by Senate Republicans and also the Attorney General?
Yes, some of them have already said so, like Senator Grassley, then Rand Paul. Grassley and Ron Johnson have demanded that all the documents pertaining to the 2016 election campaign and what the Democrats did at that point with Ukraine should be all published and made available to the American people. Then you have the Barr-Durham investigation, which now should take on full speed. But I think the Democrats were, if they still can think, which is a question at this point, they were well advised to reflect on why they lost so much. And if they want to be wiped out as a party completely, then they should continue. I mean, the population and the absolute debacle of the Iowa caucus election, really demonstrates that they don't get their act together. The population clearly is fed up with Russiagate, with the impeachment process, that the Democrats are obsessed in not addressing the issues of livelihood and jobs and so forth, what the population really cares about. So I think, when Nancy Pelosi ripped apart the speech of Trump, I had really the memory of this fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, who was trying to get the daughter of the queen, I think. And when it turned out that he was outmaneuvered, he ripped himself in the middle in two pieces. And that is the image I have of Nancy Pelosi, Nancy Rumpelstiltskin Pelosi, one should call her from now on. And I think, the Democrats are completely, have proven to be absolutely incapable of reflecting why they lost in 2016. And I think this is, in a certain sense, the erroneous working, because if you think that they condoned everything what the Bush administrations did against my husband, they stole the delegates in Arkansas, which my husband had won, in a complete violation of any kind of practice. And I think it's right now the moment to really escalate also the campaign for the exoneration of my husband, because, as I said, and we discussed it many times, that the American population urgently need to read in depth the works of my husband, to study the proposals of physical economy, to really look at the broad scope of scientific method which my husband has developed, which is absolutely what is needed at this moment. And that is why the exoneration is so absolutely crucial, because people have to have an unbiased view on the works of LaRouche in this critical moment. And I think that the biggest danger right now is really that they will try after this Iowa debacle to pull out Bloomberg, who's now gearing up. He's doubling his expenses as a billionaire, trying to buy up the vote. He hired just 2,000 more helpers for most of the states. And it's just something which is very dangerous, because Bloomberg, together with the former governor of the Bank of England and soon to be the replacement of Bloomberg in the UN for climate questions, these are the two people who are right now the biggest threat to the world economy, because if they succeed in any way to impose their green financing schemes, this can create absolute havoc in the situation. Green financing, circular economy, I mean, this is a really dangerous thing. And the Democratic Party changed the rule. The DNC changed the rules so that Bloomberg can come in at a late point, and become obviously the one who is supposed to pick up the pieces from where the Iowa caucus left it. So while the moment is good, Trump is out of the box, but it is not yet in any way the time to become complacent. But I think the most crucial battle is going to take place now. And the exoneration of Linda LaRouche is an absolute centerpiece to get the full-fledged new paradigm program realized, hopefully at some of these summits, in the meeting at the Elbe or following that very soon, as quickly as possible.
Well, the Democrats have not yet learned from the failure to defend Lyndon LaRouche. In fact, they were part of the attack on Lynn, and have embraced the policies he was warning about with the green fascist policies. I mean, I think it's interesting in Iowa that there was much lower turnout than they expected, and that's because the Democratic Party continues to be anti-growth, anti-science. And the jokes are, there's so many jokes, but the fact that they couldn't even count the numbers of people in a gymnasium, how do you give them control over the world's largest economy? And I think also it proved that you don't need Putin to meddle to screw up the Democratic Party. Now, Helga, I think we should take a look now at this point on what's going on around China and the coronavirus, how serious this is, what's the reaction around the world, and the absolutely insane opportunism of the anti-China McCarthyite mob at using this moment to attack China. So what's your assessment of where we stand on this at this point?
Well, first of all, I think for objective reasons, it has to be stated that when the WHO director said that China has established a new standard how to deal with such pandemics or epidemics, that is absolutely true. I think what the Chinese government has demonstrated was an unprecedented degree of efficiency. They quarantined 60 million people, 2 major cities. They have established an incredibly fast system of erecting 3 hospitals of more than 1,000 patients each in Wuhan. And they have published the genome for other scientists in other countries to study on the urgency of a vaccine. So I think that China has done a magnificent job. And I think it's also important that the leading health organizations like the World Health Organization and also the Organization for Disease Control, WIDIT it's called, they basically said that there is no need to to exaggerate the measures. They warned against, advised against a ban, which now I think 22 countries have established a ban for Chinese people to come in, or that people who were in China in the last 2 weeks. They said that this is clearly exaggerated and not advisable. On the other side, they also expressed, several Chinese speakers and Chinese media expressed understanding that other countries also have to take measures to protect their own citizens. So, it's one thing, what President Trump also said, that he wants to give support to China. But unfortunately, you have such really unbelievable statements by Wilbur Ross, for example, who said, well, the fact that the coronavirus is now hitting China is good for the United States because it brings back jobs to the United States. I mean, this is unbelievable that he would not even have the shame to even say a thing like that. Then naturally you have a barrage of racism breaking out. The New York Times, Spiegel magazine in Germany, I think they outdid everybody by having a cover story where they had a cartoon where supposedly a Chinese person is seen with a face mask, with googles, with earphones, with a hoodie. It looks like a complete monster. And then the headline is coronavirus made in China. And there are many reports, that Chinese people or even Asian-looking people are banned from entering restaurants or other facilities in the United States, for example. I think this is really bad. I mean, the anti-China yellow peril hysteria, which is being peddled by some people, anybody who says this should be really absolutely blasted for their racism. And this is exactly the kind of thing which was expressed by this former head of the policy planning department in the State Department, Karen Skinner, who had warned of the Caucasian or non-Caucasian threat to the United States. I think it's really time to overcome this kind of racist bias, and people should work together on such great challenges. This is one moment where you need to put the common aims of mankind into focus. And I think it's the great divide where the people who are racists reveal themselves, and they should be they should be really absolutely disrespected and ostracized for their disgusting views.
Well, and when you bring up the question of racism as it's related to disease and things of that sort, we have also the question of cooperation to deal with the plagues of locusts that are hitting East Africa. Again, this is potentially very devastating. And what's your sense of the potential for cooperation there, and what it says, in fact, about the effects of green policy, which made these large volume of insects possible?
Well, this is the biggest locust threat since, I think, 70 years. And it is threatening to move from Kenya and Ethiopia into Sudan, Eritrea. And, it could increase 500 times between now and the summer. And they're eating, I think these locusts are eating every day the amount of food which would be necessary to nourish 2,000 people at this stage already. So you can already foresee that a large number of people are threatened to die if this is not contained. And obviously, Africa does have nowhere near the kind of robust measures or system where they could take effective aerial spraying, which is done a little bit, but absolutely nowhere where it should be. So I think this is really something we should call on the international community, because the amount of money which was mentioned, which is needed, is really the absolute peanuts, namely $76 million would be needed. And if you think that that is about half of what Bloomberg has spent since December on advertisement to promote his green fascist agenda, I think it gives you a sense of the proportion. So I would really call on the international community to step in and basically, provide the kinds of airplanes and spray which would be necessary. And I think this is a test case. If the human population, if the world community cannot act and support a continent which is clearly, on the verge of developing, but this could set the African continent back quite a bit. So I think it's really a test of the morality of the rest of the world how we are reacting to this danger. And I think this should be brought up, and all the governments who have the means, the United States, the Europeans, Japan, India, and others, Russia, China, they should all work together to help the African continent to defeat this danger and start a real industrialization program instead.
And this goes back to one of the central points your husband has always made in terms of these fights, that what we're dealing with is the legacy of colonialism. And you had the ugly specter of Prince Charles at Davos lecturing the world on how we have to deal with overpopulation and climate. You had George Soros there doing something similar. I think it's important, Helga, when we talk about the LaRouche economic perspective, that people really understand this question of relative population density to get over this green fascism. Why don't you just say a couple of things about that? Because I think this is one of the crucial points that you've always intervened on in fighting against this depopulation policy.
Well, it's very unfortunate that, for example, the former German president Horst Köhler, who also used to be the head of the IMF at one point, now recently has come out with the need for a so-called circular economy. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. He calls for the decarbonization of the world economy, the great transformation of the economy, circular economy, meaning an economy which has no growth. And it should be obvious, that I mean, if you have that in Germany, which is one of the countries which has the best industrial potential, or one of them in the world, if you have no growth, then you could not fight something like the coronavirus. You could not make breakthrough inventions to fight new diseases, and you would leave the developing countries in the condition they are. So, these are formulations used by Schellenhuber, the former head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Effects, who many years ago said that the carrying or so-called carrying capacity of the planet is only 1 billion. Now, it is a fact that if you go out of nuclear energy, which Germany stupidly has done, nobody who's in their right mind understands why Merkel ever did that. This was the biggest mistake in her entire time in office. But if you also go out of fossil fuels and only go to so-called alternative energy, solar, wind, then the energy flux density used in this is absolutely only sufficient for 1 billion people. So when people are talking about green financing, circular economy, people should be absolutely alarmed, because what they really mean is depopulation. And I know from having been an opponent of this policy since ever since the Club of Rome published their stupid lies about the limits to growth, Meadows and Forrester writing this book at the early 70s. These were always meant to depopulate the world. I mean, these are ideologues. These are people who are in the tradition of Malthus, of the British East India Company. They have never really changed their their outlook. I mean, these are people who believe slave trade is okay, opium trade was okay, and they are the ones who presently could not care less if there are many people dying in Africa. They just think, oh, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, this is actually a good thing because it helps to balance the planet. Now, we have a real problem, that people do not understand the connection between energy flux density in the production process and the relative potential population density, which can be maintained with that specific level. And if you want to have the present 7 billion people to have a decent life, you absolutely have to go to the fourth generation of nuclear energy. You have to replace unsafe, relatively unsafe nuclear plants with inherently safe nuclear plants, like the pebble bed reactor, like the HTR and other models based on the thorium cycle. You have to join in a crash program for fusion economy, and all of these problems can be managed. But I think people have to realize that when we are looking at Bloomberg, at Mark Carney, and unfortunately also Horst Köhler, for that matter, who I had hoped at some point he would be a little bit better, but now he has collapsed morally really badly. These people are ideologues, and they want to make money with green financing, but there is a much, much more ugly and darker side to what they are proposing, and that is that they think that there are people who should be protected if they belong to the upper crust of 1% of people having the privileges of the casino economy, but that the large mass of population should be decimated, and that they are useless eaters which should be gotten rid of. Now, some people may think this sounds too hard, but I think that if you are really looking at why is Africa in this condition, there is no need to. People are freaked out about China in Africa, but why did the West not industrialize Africa since a long time? Why did the West not do what the Chinese are now doing, namely to bring in infrastructure, industrial parks, energy, communication, and therefore create the infrastructural condition for the continent to develop? The West was pursuing colonial policy for hundreds of years. The IMF conditionalities was an absolute continuation of that, and the green financing is an effort to keep the development of Africa, Latin America, and some Asian countries down and prevent it from occurring. So we are really looking at the end of a paradigm of oligarchism, colonialism, and imperialism, which is really an ugly thing, and it must be urgently overcome. And I think the optimism which was expressed by President Trump in his State of the Union address, if you look at the very important statements of Putin already 2 years ago, where he said Russia can play an important role to electrify all of the African continent, to turn the lights on in Africa. If you look at what China has promised in terms of the overcoming of poverty around the world, including Africa, that is the orientation the large powers have to cooperate. And then those countries who want to stick to something which is really, in the tradition of eugenics and genocide, they should, be outmaneuvered, and a different agenda should be put on the agenda. So that is a serious matter, and I think the locust question in Africa should not be treated any lighter than the coronavirus question, because it may not be as threatening as a spread to other countries, but it is a moral indicator of where the human species stands.
And people can find on the Schiller Institute website articles that you've written over the years on this topic. And I would urge people not just to read these, but to circulate them and to join the Schiller Institute and join our mobilization right now. Now, Helga, speaking of the mobilization, we had the opportunity to hear from a farmer who's been involved in the demonstrations in Germany, who spoke at the Busok Party Conference over the weekend. The demonstrations are continuing in Europe, and now it looks as though we're beginning to pull together U.S. support for that. So how does this fit into the whole picture that you've just described?
Well, the German farmers have been suffering for a very long time because the prices they get from the food chains primarily is maybe half of what they need. I think the different food chains have now lowered the milk price to 9 cents per liter, when they would need 40 cents to be break even. That is not even the parity price. So what these farmers express when they do their sort of flash mob tractorcades, which they want to continue, they're fighting for their survival. And there is right now a real rethinking among the yellow vests in France, among the farmers in Germany, where they understand that they have to address the larger picture, because why would anybody wish to wipe out agriculture, to destroy that which is the basis for the nourishment of the entire population? So I think it's very important that when some of our colleagues in the United States were briefing organizations there, like the Kansas cattle farmers or some organizations in South and North Dakota and Minnesota and Virginia, they did not know anything about the situation of the German farmers or the situation in Europe in general. When they learned about it, they immediately said, look, we have to express our solidarity, because the situation of the US farmers is also, in some parts as bad. So they sent a message of support. And I think it's very important that, the different groupings, different social groupings in each country, but also the groupings among different nations, really understand that this is a question which can only be solved on the highest level. There are no more partial solutions, but we need a new financial system, a credit system, a new Bretton Woods, which is according to the real intention of Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was much better than the actual Bretton Woods, which was implemented then by people like Truman and Churchill, because Franklin D. Roosevelt was absolutely committed to provide large credits for the industrialization of the developing countries. And that is an additional component which needs to be added in such a new Bretton Woods agreement. And once you decide to stop geopolitics, to stop thinking about the profit of a few, but you really start to be concerned about the development of the whole human species, all the problems can be solved. And I think the fact that we have President Trump, President Xi Jinping, Putin, Modi, and once these have formed an alliance, then others can join. There are many other useful and decent people and countries which can join, but we need to have a completely different system, a system which is devoted to the common good and not to the speculators. So a national bank in every country, connect these national banks in the form of a credit system, and we can solve all problems. But people have to think big and look over their plate, because if you only look at your single interest, you will miss the opportunity which is in front of us. So join the Schiller Institute, because we plan to be absolutely spearheading this fight internationally. We will put out more programs, what needs to be done. And this is our expertise. We have published this very important study. The new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge. There are already 2 volumes of that. We have published a study to extend the Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, which is a complement of the World Land Bridge report. And there are the blueprints of how we can actually fix this world. So I can only appeal to you, join the Schiller Institute, and let's really end this period of history where some portions of the human species is condemned to poverty and backwardness, because we have it in our hands to create a truly human world with a new paradigm of all nations working together for the common good of all of us.
And I just add one more thing for those of you out there who are still pessimists, and I see it all the time with some of your responses on the YouTube page of the Schiller Institute website. All you have to do is look at this fight around Russiagate, Ukrainegate, and realize that this is a fight that we won. And it was Trump's optimism, but it was the fight of the Schiller Institute to go out to the public and the population to bring up what the real battle is, and what Helga's just saying about look at the big strategic picture rather than your own misery. That's how you get out of pessimism. So Helga, thanks for joining us. And anything else you want to add?
No, I think it's the time to become active. I think people should not sit on the fence, but there are moments in history where you really can change things. These are the star hours of history. They don't come every day, but I think the year 2020 is one of these moments where an old system is collapsing, and there is absolutely the potential to put in a new and better system. So that is what I think people should really become very, very conscious about and join us.
Okay, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.
Okay.